Good afternoon, dear colleagues. As usual, wait a few seconds until everybody has connected, and then we get started immediately. Sorry for the few minutes of delay, entirely due to me. Okay, I think we have now the starting number. Usually the numbers increase during the call, and I'm very glad that today we have this call where we can discuss the latest trends from the other side of the Atlantic. The title of this webinar is Decoding Washington, an update on the US policy debate and US sanctions towards Russia. And I'm very glad that we could invite today our friend Dan Russell, President and CEO of the US-Russia Business Council, short USRBC. Very glad to see again also Laura Brank, Managing Partner and Moscow Head of the Russia Practice of Decoding. And we have with us Ivan Timofeyev, Director of Programs at the Russian International Affairs Council. Good mix of speakers, good mix of perspectives and topics. We'll touch upon first on the Russia in the US policy discussion and implications for business. That is what Dan will, I think it's more or less about your daily work you will speak, because that's what you do. You follow the latest debates, try to get the latest insights on what is going on and what are the next steps that are in preparation. Laura, as usual, we appreciate your update on the US sanctions. There have been a couple of novelties that have introduced over the last weeks and months that we have not yet discussed in detail. So your expert view on this, as always, will be most appreciated. And then, of course, with Ivan, the US-Russia relations, a little bit provocative or maybe pessimistic question, what is left? But at the same token, this also implies that there is something left and that there is something that future restart and development can be built on. I think the reasons for us, even as a European Business Association, choosing this focus on the US are quite evident. We all understand that first of all, there is a very close alignment and effort in synchronizing policy between Brussels and Washington. And so this means on the one side, obviously, that the Americans look very closely what the Europeans are doing, but it also means that we need to look very closely on the important initiatives and decisions that are made in Washington. Second, also because we understand that by the geopolitical nature of the conflict, this is not often said openly, but it is clear that the involvement is very big, and that the US obviously is a major stakeholder in this whole process. And therefore, for our companies, it's crucial to understand and to have these background insights that our speakers today can share with you. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to our first guest speaker, to Dan Russell. And Dan, we saw each other a couple of weeks ago, beginning of October in Moscow. It was a great pleasure, and I'm all the more happy to see you again on one of our webinars.
Well, thank you very much, Tadzio. And I would just say, to echo the comments you made at the beginning, that we're all in this together. I spend a lot of time talking to US businesses as well as European businesses and Russian businesses. And I'm struck by the fact the interests of the stakeholders are all pretty similar. So I think it's important for us to understand the policy backdrop to what we're all doing. And that's kind of what I would like to focus my comments on, as sort of an opener to the discussion. And I hope we have a robust Q&A. And Laura and Yvonne, who are recognized experts, will take this down one level in more granular detail. So what I'm going to try to do is give essentially a scene setter, the view, if you like, from Washington. And I think, starting with the backdrop, one of the important things to remember is that the focus in Washington right now is not on foreign policy. It's on domestic politics. Ordinary people aren't concerned about what's going on abroad. They are concerned about mainly two things. One, petrol prices, the price at the pump. And secondly, the higher cost of living, particularly their grocery bills. President Biden and his administration are trying to address these issues by releasing petroleum from our strategic reserve and with fiscal and monetary policies to try to lower inflation. These issues are particularly important in politics right now because in under 2 weeks, we face the midterm congressional elections. And most people believe that the Democrats will lose control of the lower house and the upper house. The Senate is an open question, but the Republicans could take this as well. So as always, economics, not politics, are the key issues here. Now, talking about U.S. policy towards Russia, I think the administration has maintained command of foreign policy issues, particularly with regard to Russia. And this is important when we talk about this, because this is a real change from the Trump administration, where the Congress was a big player in all the things that matter to us. All of the major actions taken by the United States since February 24th are executive actions taken by the president. I mean, the congressional role has really been reduced to passing funding bills for the administration's assistance to Ukraine. The only impactful legislation we've seen that's passed was the revocation of most favored nation status for Russia, which had to be done legally by Congress, but this was still a measure that was a presidential initiative. So I think when we look at the U.S. Policy response to the special military operation, I mean, the elements are pretty clear. First is obviously support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, both diplomatically and politically. Secondly is to provide Ukraine with both security and economic assistance. Third has been to impose sanctions and export controls on Russia. And in all of these things, I think a key element is that the United States, I think, has made special efforts to do so in concert with its allies and partners. And in terms of initiatives, that really means the European Union and the United Kingdom. I think the administration's red lines remain. President Biden made them very clear before February 24th that there would be no U.S. troops on the ground and no escalation into a broader European war. So I think we had a pretty consistent policy for the last 8 months, and I think we've seen steadfast cooperation between the United States and Europe. And I think when I look back at the sanctions cooperation since 2014, I think the idea that there's going to be some sort of falling out or break between the United States and Europe on the top line issues, I think is hard to imagine. So when we look at what's been done, I think the most important thing in the first response has been U.S. security and economic assistance to Ukraine. As of mid-October, the U.S. has delivered over $17.5 billion worth of assistance since February. And that's important when we talk about really the second pillar, the one that matters the most to us, which are sanctions and export controls. And I think it's important to remember that this administration looks at sanctions as a tool of a more comprehensive policy rather than a policy by itself. And the goals of sanctions and export controls have been refined. In February and March, you heard most US officials talk about imposing costs, that the idea of sanctions before February 24th had been to deter and dissuade Russia. And after the 24th, it was to impose costs. And that's morphed a little bit. There are three goals that you hear from US policymakers. I think the first is to deprive Russia of the resources and technology it can use to sustain the special military operation. Secondly, is to reduce US and US partners' reliance on Russia. And third is to maintain global markets in key commodities. And like I said, I think it's important to review this because this is a refinement from what we heard even 5 or 6 months ago. Sanctions, particularly financial sanctions, were designed to have a short-term or immediate effect. Since February, the US has designated roughly 2,000 individuals and entities. It's blocked or frozen about $30 billion worth of sanctioned Russian assets, and it's immobilized about $300 billion worth of assets of the central bank. These aren't my statistics. These are the statistics from the US. So you get an idea of how they're looking at this. Export controls were always intended to be more of a mid to long-term tool. And the target has clearly been dual use and high-tech items, particularly semiconductors, microelectronics, advanced computing. And Laura will probably have more to say about this. So what's missing in this picture? Diplomacy. And as a former diplomat, that certainly concerns me. We've seen extremely limited high-level engagement this year between the senior levels of the US administration and the Russian administration. I'm sorry to say there are no serious talks at a senior level. We were happy, I think, everyone, to see the US Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff engage with Minister of Defense Shoigu. But in fact, military to military channels, which worked well in the past, particularly in Syria, have all but stopped. So hopefully this new round of engagement with Minister Shoigu may be the start of something more, but I wouldn't count on it. The only serious diplomatic effort we've seen was not led by the United States or Europe, but instead by the United Nations and Turkey. And I'm referring to the Black Sea grain initiative that helped to get Ukrainian grain back to world markets and facilitated exports of Russian food and fertilizer. So the last thing I want to talk about before I turn it back to Tadzio is a look ahead from the Washington perspective. And I think in Washington, the main concern right now is the Russian response in all of its elements to Ukraine's counteroffensive. I think that's what's keeping people up at night here. In terms of sanctions, the framework is in place. And starting in the summer, what we saw was rather than new initiatives, regular two-pronged approach to one, tighten and refine sanctions, to use the language they use here, which for us means more individual designations and trying to align. Align is another word used a lot here, European and UK sanctions with the US. The second part of that is dealing with enforcement, targeting sanctions evasion. And we've seen lots of trips by senior, particularly US Treasury officials, to India, to Turkey, talking not only to the governments, but also to the business groups. The only new thing I think that's out there is this idea of an oil, a price cap on Russian crude oil, which we're all kind of aware of. And we have kind of an odd situation where senior political levels in the United States are firmly committed to this idea, while industry experts almost uniformly think it's impractical. The European dimension of this is kind of unclear. I'm not sure quite where this is going, to be honest. It changes day to day, but I'm not sure we will see full implementation in its original form. That's my opinion. I think that there are a number of people who think that there already is a discount for Russian oil, and disrupting markets further is probably not the right move at this point. Things that are coming up that should be of concern to everybody. One, the grain deal, the Black Sea grain deal, that's going to expire in mid-November. There have been lots of people both in Washington and elsewhere who are pessimistic about its renewal, which I think would be very unfortunate. We have a couple of key general licenses issued by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control at Treasury, that will come up for that are set to expire in December, and it's an open question whether they'll be renewed. I think the most important one for your membership is the general license that permits companies to do what we would call ordinary transactions with the Ministry of Finance and the central bank. Pay your taxes, pay your payroll taxes, customs duties, all of these things. Yeah, you'll never get a straight answer, but it's been renewed several times since it was originally put in place. There is another general license related to energy that I think is of less importance, and frankly, I think that one probably has less of a chance of being renewed. But those are certainly important. And I want to finish up on Congress, coming back to where we started. Because if we have a Republican Congress, that does not mean there is going to be a change in U.S. policy. I think what many responsible Republicans are suggesting is that lots of U.S. taxpayer dollars are being pumped into Ukraine. And the U.S. needs to take care about accountability on what exactly that money's being spent for. I don't think this is a negative at all. I think you could argue that it's a little bit of a course correction and might help to keep bipartisan support. There are other people who differ with that view, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that's right. So Tadzio, I welcome the discussion and Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dan. And I'm sure that there will be indeed questions and points that we will kind of dig a bit deeper because the breadth of the questions that you open up in your intervention obviously requires further discussion. But thank you so much, and also thank you really for the good cooperation. I did not mention that in the introductory statement, but I really appreciate the very friendly and cooperative relations that we have with the USRBC when we have been working together on different issues, be it during the COVID times or during the crisis that we are actually living through. Always good to know that to work together with strong partners. Okay, then let's move to the second speaker of today, Laura. As I said, welcome back. It's a while we have not spoken, but a lot of things have happened since.
Yes.
Both on the European side, several rounds of sanctions have been added to the ones that were already in place when we last spoke. On the US as well, OFAC issued additional clarifications and licenses also. So there is a lot to talk about today. And we are looking forward to how you can guide our members through this increasing jungle of restrictions and measures.
Thank you so much, Tadzio, and thank you for inviting me again. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your team as usual for being so organized and helpful. It's always a challenge to follow Dan because he's a very good friend and always has incredible insights into what's going on in Washington. so challenging to follow him. But let me start with one of the comments that he mentioned about the fact that we now have this framework in place. So back when I was speaking in front of AEB in the spring, this was all just starting to come together, and we've had over 8 months now of relentless sanctioning in setting up this framework for the sanctions and the export controls. These are very nuanced, very complex sanctions. In some cases, I think a lot of practitioners, a lot of people would almost prefer you just do a complete sanctions ban or something, only because it would be much less complicated than what we have right now in terms of following this. So I don't know how much clarity I could give to the membership, because even for lawyers who have practiced in the sanctions world for decades are having a hard time keeping up with and trying to follow these sanctions, and there's a lot of confusion. For once, I think in a lot of respects the EU has almost done more than the US has done. In terms of, the number of people sanctions, the type of things that have been subject to export controls, et cetera. But to go back to your initial point, Tazio, about, it's good to know what's going on with the US, it's vital, frankly, because even though the EU has put in place many of these sanctions over the last 8 months that are very similar to the US sanctions, the enforcement aspect is still very much lagging behind the US. And the US has this sort of scary secondary sanctions, which means that non-US persons could be held liable. And that's really, it really has the teeth. And you've seen over the last few months, there have been some indictments in the US against various persons for evading sanctions. So I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. I'm going to put up a presentation right now, if I could be successful in doing this. Can you see it?
We can see a disclaimer for now. But,
okay. The most important thing a lawyer gives is a disclaimer.
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let me make sure I can go forward with the next slide. Hang on a minute. Okay, there we go. Okay. So let me just talk about what the framework is so far with respect to sanctions. And as Dan said, this started obviously before February. We've been talking about sanctions for years, and especially US sanctions. But what's been rolled out in the last 8.5 months includes sanctions that are coming from different US authorities and have different aspects to them, although there has been an enormous amount of coordination, not just with the EU and other sanctioning countries, but internally in the US, in the domestic market between US Treasury, which is the implementing authorities, OFAC, as Dan mentioned, the State Department, which has its own sort of ability to put people on a list, and certainly coordinates the list with OFAC, and then the Department of Commerce, which issues and implements and oversees these export controls. So in terms of OFAC, first of all, we have these blocking asset freezing sanctions. And as Dan said earlier, he mentioned over 2,000, it's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 new persons. There are a bunch of others that have been sanctioned under other authorities. So they were previously sanctioned, and now they've been sanctioned under new authorities as well. As Dan mentioned, all of these sanctions, all of this is the new sanctions, mostly the new kinds of sanctions, meaning that they're executive, coming from this executive branch. The good news about that, and not having Congress involved, is that the US could, in theory, also remove these sanctions without having to go through Congress. So that's a probably the only positive aspect of these sanctions is that the executive branch does have control over them, unlike under the Trump administration, where we had CATSA and things were very much out of control and run by Congress, as Dan had mentioned. Dan also mentioned this freeze on the central bank assets, and also note that most of the large Russian banks have indeed been sanctioned by now. There with some notable exceptions, and of course they've been removed. A number of them have been removed from SWIFT which makes it very difficult to implement and administer cross-border payments. Right in the beginning, when this framework was set up, the president, under the executive order, said that there would be certain sectors of the Russian economy that would be subject to potential sanctioning. So prior to February 24th, 25th, the only sector that really had been designated under this authority was the defense sector, the defense and intelligence sector. But following that, and this has been rolled out over the last 8.5 months, you have financial services that have been one of the sectors, aerospace, electronics, the marine sector, and then accounting, trust and corporate formation services, management consulting, and most recently, quantum computing. So this is separate from the ban on services, which I talk about in the next bullet point. But this means that these are sectors of the Russian economy that the U.S. will specifically be looking to target for sanctions purposes. Separately, under a different authority, the U.S. has prohibited the provision of certain services being provided by U.S. persons in Russia. So not to Russian persons, but those services being provided in Russia itself. So if a Russian party is outside, if you have a Russian subsidiary, a U.S. person can provide those services, they just cannot provide them in Russia. Those include the same types, so the accounting services, auditing, et cetera, management consulting, which is defined very broadly. I'll talk about that in a second. Trust and corporate formation services, and quantum computing. There are exceptions to this, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then there's a ban on new investment by U.S. persons. So no new investment in Russia by U.S. persons. On the export control side, which goes through the Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security, this is the government body that administers the export controls. So since February, you've seen a series of export and as well as import bans, including these very unique provisions that prohibit the re-export or transfer of certain controlled items, even within Russia. Big issue for us, especially for companies that are exiting the market, because they have all this equipment that they shipped in that wasn't even, potentially controlled beforehand, or they got a license beforehand to ship this equipment to Russia, and now they can't transfer it over to a Russian buyer without a license from Commerce in order to be able to transfer over that type of equipment. So this is a very impactful provision. And then similarly, even products that were not on the Commerce control list, low technology items, depending on the end user, may also not be transferred or re-exported in Russia. In addition, there have been denial of exports of items needed for oil refinery. And then, of course, this export of luxury goods, which is still not clear to me why we needed that. And then, of course, a series of import bans on various products from Russia. So that all falls under the rubric of what I would say these export-import controls. And in my mind, the sanctions are complex and nuanced, but these export controls are even more complex and more difficult to follow. And I cannot tell you how confusing it is, for our clients, because, they'll have equipment that's sitting in Taiwan, and they'll say, well, this, the equipment's in Taiwan, and, it's used equipment. It's like, yes, but it still has this U.S. content. It still uses U.S. tools or software in its construction, and therefore it's banned from being exported to Russia and re-exported in Russia. So it's an enormously complex set of rules. If there is a certain amount of content, U.S. content in it, then it's very difficult to export it to Russia. And these are the subject of lots of anti-circumvention measures. The EU is also trying to do something very similar in trying to prohibit the circumvention of these export controls by non-EU persons exporting these items to Russia. Just a moment, because in talking with people about what's banned and what's not banned in terms of services and the confusion between the US and the EU on the ban of services, most recently in its 8th package, the EU went a little bit further, in my mind, much further than the US in now banning legal advisory services. The US has not done that yet. I don't, I've gotten out of the business of trying to predict things, but it seems unlikely. Legal services are so fundamental to due process in the U.S. concept that it seems hard to believe that will be banned. But who knows, that could come next. But the U.S. has banned the provision of accounting services, management consulting. Management consulting is very broad because it includes, M&A, strategic advice, even things like, marketing programs, HR, executive search firms have been, covered by the management consulting ban. Corporate formation and trust services. So that's really more about really focused on the trust aspect, for people standing in as directors for Russian persons. Most recently, as I mentioned, this quantum computing. And then, of course, the ban on new investment. On the EU side, they also have, tax, auditing, bookkeeping, most recently, IT consulting, trust, and most recently, again, architectural and engineering services, PR services specifically identified, and then a ban on investment in energy. So for EU persons, they may invest, but just not in the energy sector, which of course is rather broadly defined. What's interesting on this is on the US side with respect to services, US persons can provide these services to subsidiaries or parties that are directly or indirectly controlled by US persons in Russia. And they could also provide these services to subsidiaries of non-Russian entities. So for example, EU persons, they could provide these services, but only to the extent it's connected to wind down or divestiture. This has been a huge problem for a lot of EU persons, for example, working for subsidiaries of US companies. It makes absolutely no sense. Why, if a US person can do it for a US entity, why an EU person? But anyway, this is where we are. On the EU side, there is an exception for companies that are owned or controlled by EU companies, and also for their partners. So it does cover the US, it does cover the UK, for example. So that's a more favorable, but the services are broader, but sort of more favorable in that regard. Happy to answer questions on that. So where are we going? And as Dan mentioned, right now there's, as he mentioned, tightening and refining of these sanctions and the focus on enforcement. So that's where we are going, because the US has done everything that they could. Well, I'm sure they can find other things to do, but it's really been about setting out this framework. And now what it is about tinkering with the framework, adding new names. You're not going to see these massive new types of sanctions coming out, or massive numbers of names. It's about tinkering, and it's very much about enforcement. As Dan mentioned, the U.S. authorities have been to countries like Turkey and Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and India, explaining the sanctions to them and making them understand that they will enforce for evasion of the U.S. sanctions. So one of the things that was done this summer is that the U.S., while it did not sanction the mayor payment system, it basically did sanction the senior officers of the national payment system, and it designated a number of other persons. And then it put out this warning, and this warning in particular to non-U.S. financial institutions that have been using the mayor payment system and saying, you risk evading U.S. sanctions by using these systems, because you're helping sanctioned persons to avoid sanctions, circumvent sanctions, and you're facilitating their ability to evade sanctions. And it put out, I'm sure most of you are now familiar with these FAQs, but it put out this new FAQ a couple months ago saying that it is prepared to use its authorities with respect to sanctions evasions. And it specifically mentioned including the efforts to expand the use of the mirror payment system. So as soon as this FAQ was put out, by the way, a number of Turkish banks, for example, immediately stopped using the mirror payment system. So this is the fear that the U.S. authorities can put out in terms of the whole point about evading sanctions. So earlier this month, to sort of further enforce or to sort of emphasize this whole idea about, look, this is what we're focusing on now. We're focusing on enforcement. We're focusing on evasion. A joint alert was put out by Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, the State Department, and it sort of took this whole summary of these are all the actions that we've taken since February to target the military-industrial complex in Russia. And it said specifically, we will continue to use our authorities against persons both inside and outside of Russia that engage in sanctions evasion or circumvention. And it mentioned specifically in this alert a couple of weeks ago, here are some of the things that we've done. For example, we've gone after this Uzbek-based entity because this entity was facilitating transactions, evasion of the sanctions on behalf of Radio Automatica. Radio Automatica had been sanctioned in March, and then it was accusing a number of front companies of acting on behalf of Radio Automatica in trying to evade sanctions and helping to procure certain technologies on behalf of Radio Automatica. And then in June, OFAC designated 3 Russian entities and another entity based in Asia, saying that it was linked to an FSB procurement effort to obtain US, Japanese, and European components for defense purposes. And then simultaneously with the sanctioning of those entities, it put out Department of Commerce put out an alert together with this newly created Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, which is set up to sort of go after oligarch assets, but in general, to trace the money, to follow the money. And it basically put something out that went to non-US financial institutions as well as US financial institutions. But the focus was really on letting non-US financial institutions understand what those export restrictions are. And it gave them a list of commodities of concern for possible export control evasion. So as soon as it did that, and over the summer, we've seen a lot of things happen in terms of Turkish banks, European banks just freezing payments for export of goods, even if those items are not actually subject to export controls. I call this shoot and then ask questions, because that's exactly what we're seeing with this overcompliance. Is that it's really about the banks are very concerned. As Dan mentioned, they've gotten these, hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and billions of dollars in fines in connection with sanctions evasion. So they're taking no chances. And I think that's one of the things that are really affecting people. So let me end this by saying, when can this happen? When can non-US persons be potentially liable for circumventing or evasion of US sanctions? So the law specifically states that if a non-US person has materially assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technological support for or goods or services in support of any activities that are sanctionable, so i.e. those sectors that I mentioned before that are particularly vulnerable or subject to potential sanctions, and also any persons and interest in persons who are blocked. So basically it means anytime you provide any material assistance or goods to a sanctioned person, you could potentially subject yourself to secondary sanctions. They define facilitation. It's when a non-U.S. person facilitates a violation of sanctions by either guaranteeing transportation on behalf of a sanctioned person, or any other kind of facilitation that a non-U.S. person is doing. And then evasion is any transaction with the intent or effect of evading sanctions are prohibited. So it's not, it does require some knowledge of the fact that you are avoiding sanctions, that the person is sanctioned, and that you are, in fact, working with intent. What the U.S. is particularly concerned about are deceptive transactions, these structured transactions where it's clear that the parties are creating new structures in order to be able to get around sanctions. So I'll end it with that, but very happy to take your questions.
Laura, as I said for Dan, there will be questions, including from my side. Thank you so much for really trying to make this as comprehensive and at the same time as kind of structured and dense as possible, because there is really a risk of losing ourselves in the sheer wealth of details and different measures that have been taken. So that to outline the great structures, the main directions, vectors that these measures are targeting and how they could potentially evolve, that was really very valuable. And now, Ivan, so almost like having to sum up what is left in the U.S.-Russia relationship, a more political view, maybe also a more scientific view, if I understand that you look at it from a think tank perspective.
Yeah.
Looking very much forward also to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Tadzo, and I'm grateful to Daniel and Laura for their extensive and very useful presentations. Well, I would start with some bad news. The first one is that the conflict in Ukraine, which is the major source of sanctions and the deterioration of commercial relations between Russia and the West, has few chances to be resolved in the foreseeable future. So we are dealing with a long-term crisis, and there is no sign that the sides are ready for any kind of diplomatic resolution. So it seems that there is a conviction both in Moscow, in Kiev, and in the Western capitals that the opposite side should be forced to take the conditions of the other due to some decisive success in the field. And it seems that we are doomed to wait and see for the development of the military situation, which is still not clear. So apparently there is a build-up on both sides, an extensive US and Western support of Ukraine, mobilization of Ukraine, and what we see, the recent partial mobilization in Russia and the build-up from the Russian side. Laura has shown a link to the recent alert published by OFAC and BIS, and there was another one published by Department of State, which echoes the key statements of the mentioned regulators. And they are stating that Russian military-industrial complex is heated to a great extent. However, in reality, I would agree that the overall impact on the Russian economy is huge. However, it will hardly change the Russian political course in general. Rather, it is the sanctions are making it more radical. And it does not have a critical, apparently it doesn't have a critical impact on the overall resolve to continue the conflict, right? So unfortunately, the conflict will go on, and we will live with all the risks which are generated by the conflict. Another thing is about an illusion which is quite often manifested in the Russian press, that the Western sanctions are over. I'm very skeptical about this. Well, true that most of the existing instruments has been already used, and Laura did a great job showing the major trends, including the blocking sanctions, sectoral sanctions, investment bans, export controls, import bans, oil cap, visa bans, restrictions on media broadcasting, etc., etc., etc. However, this does mean that sanctions are over. It is possible at least to expand the existing lists, for instance, to expand the entity list, to expand the SDN list, to expand the regulation at 833 appendixes, the regulation 269 appendix 1, etc., etc. So while this is quite an endless process, and the basic scenario is that the lists will be expanded in the future, and the only obstacle for this process is the damage and outlays which may be faced by the US, EU, and other members of the sanctions coalition. So the OFAC and other regulators are quite careful to calibrate sanctions to avoid collateral damage to global economy, international transactions, etc. Though you never know. So it's not clear, for instance, what would be the impact of the oil cap on the oil prices. So the market is very nonlinear, and one can never know what would be the impact on the price, what would be the impact on the expectations of investors, etc., etc. So Laura demonstrated that the level of coordination between the US and the EU, and I would add Great Britain here, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and Japan, by the way, that the level of coordination is quite high. And true that EU at some point and Great Britain at some point is in advance. However, the United States sanctions are still most critical. So if we imagine that all other initiators are revoking their sanctions for one reason or another tomorrow, and US keeps them in effect, this wouldn't change the situation dramatically, because the international business is compliant primarily to the United States sanctions due to the threat of secondary sanctions. But secondary sanctions is even not the major problem, because if you look at the data, the precedents of the use of secondary sanctions are quite few. So they exist. I mean, and some of them are very famous, like COSCO shipping tanker, or the subsidiaries of Rosneft, or well, some others. The list is well known, right? But enforcement is a bigger problem, and the understanding, quite broad understanding of the US authorities, of the US jurisdiction. And I would subscribe to what Laura said about the export control legislation of the US. This is not a piece of cake for for analysts like us, and that's why export control is a kind of a not beloved child in the family. So all the analysts love sanctions. Analysts love financial sanctions because they are very easy to contemplate. But most of us are quite confused with export control. It's quite complicated. But again, it's complicated in the sense of interpretation of the de minimis rule, for instance, how to define the percentage of the American components, how to define the existence of the relation to an American license, or the connection to an American software or equipment, etc. So at some point, there is a need of, there are situations when people like Laura or myself, we need to become technical experts, right? So when we are working with clients, when we need to provide an expertise on the supply of a particular good, we have to become engineers or specialists in this or that particular equipment, right? So it's quite complicated, and this complexity generates overcompliance among business. Scary stories about enforcement, about $1 million fees, fines by OFAC, by BIS, by DOJ, or criminal cases raised by DOJ, including those mentioned by lawyering representation. They are all affecting business in a way that quite often it's easier for business just to abstain from deals with Russia than to invest into such complicated expertise, right? This is one of the sources of the overcompliance, complemented by the gospeling of the OFAC representatives and BIS representatives globally, right, explaining the consequences, etc. So I mean, this is a very long-term trend, and the US sanctions remain the cornerstone of global sanctions regime and one of the major risks on the sanctions front for the international business, right? A good thing is that US sanctions are still very transparent in a sense of legal reflection. Yes, it is complicated, but if you compare them to informal Chinese sanctions, well, US sanctions, even export control, is a piece of cake, right? Right. Okay. So, but let's get back to political issues. Even if we are, well, the conflicts sooner or later end, right? So I hope that at some point there will be an end to the crisis in Ukraine. Would that mean that sanctions are revoked linearly or proportionally to the ceasefire? I am quite skeptical about this, and research on sanctions shows that quite often the resolution of the conflict itself does not necessarily mean that sanctions are being revoked. Daniel has pointed an important aspect about the relations between Congress and the administration, and the major thing is that all the brand new sanctions against Russia are fixed in executive orders. So most of them are still not in the statute, in the U.S. legislation. However, politically speaking, and this is what makes sanctions against Russia different from the ones against Iran, because Iran, the regime of sanctions against Iran is very deeply rooted in the legislation. So I even heard a term in the US, which is the web of sanctions laws against Iran. So that's why the administration is confined, is very constrained in terms of negotiations with Iran. They simply cannot overcome the limits of the legislation. So this is not the case for Russia, but still the political price of revoking sanctions, even if they are in the executive orders, is extremely high. And here, again, Daniel mentioned that Americans are now preoccupied with the internal affairs, with the economy, which is always the case. So internal policy for the US is something which is a priority. And I would refer here to a famous concept of the two presidents, which was, this terms was coined by Dr. Wildavsky in 1968. So he was studying the relations between Congress and the president, and he revealed that there are two presidents in the United States. The one is the foreign policy president, another is the internal policy president. So, and their adherence, their behavior on these two tracks is very different. So in a sense, foreign policy track is not always correlated to what's going on in internal policy. And the public attention may be more focused on internal issues, but foreign policy continues its own life, and it's pretty hard to change the path, the path dependency of this course. So we are in a long-term trend. Even if we have the agreement on Ukraine, I'm not sure that it will be sustainable. And the experience of Minsk II is very, very illustrative. So we have this agreement, but it turned out that it's impossible to implement it. So there is no guarantee that the new one will be implementable. This is number one. And number two is that even if there is agreement, sanctions may remain in place. So some of them may be softened, but in general, it's much easier to invoke sanctions than to revoke them due to institutional inertia, due to legal peculiarities of the legal process in the US and beyond, etc., etc. So the good thing, there are several good things still, right? Well, first, the escalation is seemingly under the control. So I do not see the appetite on the US and on the Russian side to escalate to a bigger conflict, right? So there is still apparently a hotline between the military people on the US and on the Russian side. This is number one. There is still quite an effective communication on strategic arms. I'm not sure that START treaty will be prolonged, but still the two sides remain quite transparent to each other on this domain. There are still, well, Russia is still, apparently, there are few aggravation on other fronts. So Ukraine is a kind of concentration of our political contradictions, but I do not see the aggravations in Syria, for instance, or in other regions, right? So I had been more pessimistic about it. So I hadn't anticipated that we will have more crises in other regions, which is not the case, and which is good, right? Another good thing is that Russia is still a market economy. Market economy is one of the important factors which makes Russia more adapted to sanctions. So unlike Soviet economy, Russian economy is now more flexible and market is very functional. And market economy is a kind of an investment to the future, because when the political dust will settle down, it may take years or decades, but at some point we will enter another price. The existence of market economy in Russia will make the process of further interaction easier, right? Than in case of some kind of Soviet type or deep arcade type mobilized economy. And at this current point, I don't see any appetite to make the economy less or more concentrated, more directed. To some extent, market economy is even desirable for the political power in Russia, because it allows to redistribute responsibility for the economic situation, right? So the point is that, guys, this is not only the government which is responsible for your benefit or for your welfare, but you are yourself as businesses, as companies, you are responsible as well, right? Still, many businesses left Russia, as we know. If you look at the statistics of the U.S.-Russia trade, it shrinks significantly. If you look at this monthly rates, so the decline is very significant. Still, if we see a kind of even minor, let's say, I wouldn't say the progress, but even the stabilization of this situation, there are still open doors for working in Russia, and the Russian counter-sanctions policy is still quite restrained. One of the most dangerous bills in the Russian parliament was the one which implied the criminal penalty for the implementation of the foreign sanctions, or of compliance to the foreign sanctions And the business here is still quite concerned about this, but now it is more or less clear that it is put on the shelf and it is collecting dust in the State Duma. Fortunately, right? Fortunately, you never know. But at this current point, this process of aggravation from our side and pressure on business has been halted, which is again something which I can refer to as a positive thing. So we are continuing to observe the situation. We are trying to stay as much unbiased as it is possible. And I trust that our expertise is of use for the businesses here in Russia and to our partners abroad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan, for sharing this sober analysis with us, and for clearly outlining the potential downsides, the upsides, the chances of what could happen. Let's move now to the question and answer session. As usual, please write your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that we could move you to the speaker's room. I receive a number of questions here via private chat. Please use the public chat, it's better, but I can obviously also raise the questions in the private chat. But I also have some questions of my own, and I usually start with the questions of my own, because I think this is a privilege of being a moderator. You can ask questions first. So first to you, Dan, you said that the US policy towards Russia has been mainly executive driven, White House driven, as a big difference to the Trump administration. And now with the midterm elections coming up, and you said a potentially Republican controlled House or even the Senate, what do you think that could mean? I mean, you said you would not expect a major shift in the Russia policy. What could it mean in terms of aligning with Brussels, with the EU? What could it mean in terms of speed of the reaction? It would definitely, if I understand it correctly, increase the internal policy, the weight of internal policy negotiation in foreign policy making. So I would like to, if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay, well, it's a good question, one that obviously is hard to answer, but remember that even though we have elections in November, the new Congress will not be seated until January. So in this interim period between now and January, what we call a lame duck Congress, their main goal is going to be to pass things related to the budget. And we have the Pentagon budget is enshrined in a bill called the National Defense Authorization Act. Why I'm telling you this detail is because this thing has to pass before the end of the year. And this is, if you think of it as kind of a Christmas tree, the way our legislative process works on this is this thing becomes what we would call an omnibus bill. So maybe Laura has an ornament she wants to hang up here on this bill related to Russia. Ivan has one on Ukraine. This stuff will all get caught in the mix. So this is my way of saying, don't be surprised if you see some initiatives come back before the end of the year on this. The two areas I think that business has been most concerned about, one is a ban on US government procurement from companies that do business in Russia. And that is a real concern of some companies. There's lots of other reasons that companies don't want to do this, and there are some people who are opposed to the legislation. But that's an example of the kind of thing we might see before the end of the year. In terms of what Kevin McCarthy and the Republican leadership have said of the House, the only foreign policy issue they've really been talking about is keeping a better fiscal hand on what's going on, on the aid that's going to Ukraine. They've not talked about the volume of aid. What they say is there's no blank check, that it's a lot of money, and we should be careful. And I still think that's the main issue. I don't think you're going to see a sea change there, because the minute the midterms are done, we're going to start focusing on the presidential election in 2024. And these guys are going to be focused on that like an eye on the prize. And if the Ukraine-Russia conflict doesn't contribute to a potential upswing in their fortunes, I don't think it's going to be a big issue. So that's I'm sorry, a very long way of saying I don't expect Congress to come back here. But I want to come back to a point that Ivan made, which is important, is that right now we have a sanctions design since February 24th that is flexible, scalable, and ultimately reversible. And there are certainly people who think when we do get to the negotiating table, and all conflicts end at the negotiating table, this will happen later rather than sooner, it looks like, but it will happen. These sanctions potentially could become a tool in those negotiations. But I think it's important to differentiate between the sanctions and the export controls. Ivan is very right that sanctions rarely go away. That's true. But I think in this case, you can see scenarios where sanctions could be used as negotiating leverage. I would say export controls, no. Export controls are going to be in place for a long, long time. Their stated goal is to degrade Russia's military capability. And that's very different than a Ukraine settlement.
Thank you, Dan. And my next question also from me still is to Laura. You said that the sanction setup is more or less in place. The focus will be on enforcement. So my question here would be not a technical one, but more of a kind of to get a rough understanding what that could mean. What is the price tag that or the price that could be won by enforcement? Is it 10%? Is it 25%, 50% of what you can still squeeze out in terms of focusing on enforcement, or is actually, because we also know that there is over-compliance in certain areas. So when you focus on enforcement, is that actually yielding additional results? I'm just asking because I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, on the enforcement side, there are a number of authorities that are involved in this, and often these cases, like these recent indictments, are brought by U.S. Attorney's Office. Most recently, for example, in Brooklyn, there was a case against certain sanctions evaders, and that. A lot of these cases are to make examples of people. They, by and large, there are a lot of people that are, violating sanctions, as we speak. But what the U.S. does not have the capability to go after every single case, but they like to choose cases in order to send the message to others that this is something that they will take action against. So I think it's really going to be a big shift right now of trying to select those cases. And keep in mind that the issues that are of the biggest concern to the U.S. government at this point are those kinds of high technology goods that are falling into the hands, one way or another, of the military industrial complex in Russia. And I think we'll see a lot of those types of things happening in the future. I think in general, there's understanding that Western companies that are trying to still carry on business in Russia and or extricate themselves from Russia are doing their best to try to navigate. So I don't think that, the whole focus of this policy is a gotcha kind of thing, to sort of really come down. I think, they expect Western companies to be doing their due diligence. They expect them to be asking the questions. For example, with regard to these export controls, we've been successful in getting licenses to be able to transfer this type of equipment. So they're not saying, absolutely not. And I think that people are trying to be, somewhat flexible and give people some time, but they also want people to comply. So they will make examples when they can.
Understood. And Ivan, Dan already commented on your point that sanctions rarely go away, even when there is some kind of preliminary political settlement that is reached. My question would be the same, and maybe you can simply answer to what Dan has said, in the sense that, I'm confusing two institutions here. Sorry, Dan. So what would be the incentive? Because we all know that a conflict, or as in Russian the saying goes, war all end by negotiations, and you need some leverage, you need some incentive to get there, and either you get it by military means or you have something else to offer. And I would very much hope that there is something else where we could incentivize a settlement other than to play it really out on the battlefield. So maybe you can comment on this.
Oh, it's a very good question. I mean, it's very rational from the US side to contemplate sanctions as bargaining chips. And I agree with Dan in the sense that the current legal mechanism allows flexibility. It provides the US diplomacy with an ability to correlate the possible revocation of or some sanctions in exchange of one or another political step. And I agree that we should distinguish financial sanctions from the export control. At the same time, I believe that on the level of export control, there are still different layers. It's very clear that, for instance, CCL list sanctions, the ones which imply the prohibitions to provide Russia with sensitive technologies, will remain in place in any case. So here I would echo what Dan said. At the same time, there are other levels of export control. For instance, the final rule of May 9, Laura, correct me if I'm wrong in terms of details, which implies the prohibitions of lower technology goods, like, for instance, refrigerators, lorries, etc., which is a big problem for business now. But these technologies, these products are less critical, and I believe that they can be a bargaining chip on the table. Still, the big problem is about perceptions. If you look at the perceptions here in Moscow, then this scheme of bargaining may be significantly challenged, in a sense that apparently there is a conviction in Moscow that whatever Moscow does in terms of concession, this would not cause long-term and sustainable changes in sanctions policy. So this ultimately, this is a matter of trust. It's a matter of trust, right? And I mean, here in Moscow, the example of Iran is taken very seriously. I mean, the withdrawal of Trump's administration from JCPOA, I mean, this nuclear deal, and the overall, the widespread point here is that look at Iran, right? They made a deal. It was fixed in UN Security Council resolution. But still the US abandoned and renewed sanctions, and all others, including Europeans and Chinese, had to comply, fearing the enforcement and secondary sanctions. So these are the moods in Moscow, and this may, let's say, make this rational logic of bargaining more deteriorated by psychology, by psychological factors, and this issue of trust. And it's pretty clear that there are same concerns on the US side to what extent Russians are can be trusted in the sense of the implementation of diplomatic agreement or any kind of agreement. So I mean, we are trapped with this trust issue. We shouldn't, of course, this doesn't preclude us from an action, from moving forward to fighting some resolution of the conflict, but still this would be a complicating, aggravating factor. Thanks.
I'll come back to that later because that's obviously a very interesting question, the issue of trust. But now I think it's fair to address the questions that I received privately in one question in the chat, and I think they go to Laura. So first of all, with the secondary sanction, that's a question that worries our members a lot because to put it very figuratively, where it starts, where it ends. Where does it start? Where does it end? When you have a situation where companies are looking for kind of alternative supply chain for replacements, is that already sanctionable under secondary sanctions or not? This is then in the details a very important questions for a lot of business. And I feel it in the conversations, not only in the question that was addressed to me now, but also in the conversations that I'm having with the companies, that this is something they fear very much, that they have no idea what they can actually do to react to the situation and what will be perceived as a kind of effort of evasion or circumvention. Especially that historically it was mainly the US focusing on secondary sanctions, but most recently also the EU. They have not yet reverted to kind of secondary sanctions, but they have strengthened their setup in terms of circumvention prevention. So what would be your opinion on this?
Yeah, it's very complicated.
The guidance.
Yeah, the guidance. Yeah, I mean, the guidance is obviously, you just need to know who your end user is. You need to, ensure the product is not something that's controlled, and get those types of certifications and warranties to whomever you are selling your product, that they're not going to then turn around and sell that product to a sanctioned party or the military. Or what is considered military end users. So I think, I think people can continue to do business. They just need to make sure that they're, taking proper counsel on what they can and cannot do, and making sure to document the fact that they are doing their due diligence and that they are getting those proper, warranties and certifications from the consumer, that those products are not going to end up in the hands of the wrong person.
But in some way, Laura, it's not only about ending up in the hands of the wrong person, right, but in terms of export controls, for instance.
Right.
Well, you obviously comply with sanctions in terms of not directly exporting, but you can also not physically control what happens with your goods once they have reached their alleged end user in, let's say, a third country. You cannot really control them, whether even if you enter such clauses in the contracts. The only thing you can do is you can sell once, and if it happens, then not sell a second time. But in principle, that also already gives you some exposure.
Right. So, the standard both in the EU and the US is knowledge, right? I mean, intent and knowledge matter in these laws. And if your intent is to use some circumvention techniques in order to get around sanctions, and you are blinded, or you just don't want to know who you're dealing with and where it's going to end up, then you could be. So it's awareness, and you should have known. In other words, you should have known by doing some basic due diligence that this party is an agent for a sanctioned person. It's basic due diligence, getting those basic warranties. So I do think, I think companies are maybe and that's maybe the intent, overly nervous. I had a situation this morning that was a crisis because a European company had shipped goods to Russia, which were not on the export control list. And the bank, which was in this case a Turkish bank, just did not process the payment, just froze it. Not like sanctioned the money, like you can get it out, but they just didn't process the payment. And they will not process the payment until we try to prove something, that somebody is not sanctioned, which is a hard thing to do, to disprove something, that doesn't exist. So that's what's happening a lot. So I do think you can continue to do business. You just need to be careful about, to whom you send your products and putting in those right kinds of certifications to ensure they don't run afoul of the export restrictions. And the EU has not done this yet. I mean, really, by and large, this is completely new. They've always had these anti-circumvention provisions, but not as extensive as they now contemplate in terms of that. And that's really because what's happening is you have parties that are sitting in Dubai or in Turkey or India that are buying products from the EU and then just selling them into Russia. That's what they're trying to get at. They're not trying to get at, the sort of one-offs, et cetera. And again, maybe they make examples, but, just do your due diligence, make sure you know who you're dealing with. And I think, to the extent that the item is not controlled, you should be fine.
Understood. And the second question, also the one from the chat that is visible, also I think goes to you. It is about the likelihood or the risk that sanctions prohibited activities will be extended to IT services, licenses, or cloud services, not only IT consulting, by the EU or by the US.
Yeah. So, it's a good question, and it's certainly possible that they'll go there in terms of the, certain of the other IT products, because, they're already on the edges, with IT consulting. There is a specific FAQ that essentially says, what kinds of things you can do, if something is in the public domain, if it's not sensitive technology, then it should be fine. And again, I think it's a very difficult issue for the authorities because everybody has Microsoft, everybody has on their computers, and so they're really trying to target the sensitive technologies, and to the extent that it cannot sort of hurt the national security interest, then it seems unlikely that it will go there. But nothing is outside of the realm of possibility right now.
Well,
could I add just one other dimension of that? Certainly in US government circles, when they look at these issues, there's been a question about how do we limit the items that Laura is talking about, but continue to permit channels that allow a free flow of information. There is an interest among policymakers in keeping communication channels open, and an awareness that some technologies impact on that. I just want to throw that out there as a backdrop, and that is somewhat of a constraint, I think, self-imposed constraint by some policymakers here.
Ivan, you also wanted to comment.
Just to add that there is an OFAC general license authorizing financial transactions related to internet services. This is number one. This doesn't mean that this general license allows the supplies prohibited by BIS. However, there are exemptions from BIS rules on the electronics for personal use, which again, that does not provide significant limitations for personal communication. There are informal corporate boycotts by the companies. Some of them spend their sales in Russia, etc. But this is their own ethical choice. It's not. This is not something which is still prohibited by the DOG or by the DOT or the DOC.
Right.
Thank you, Ivan, Dan, and Laura. Now we are almost at the end in terms of timing, if I understand correctly, and also there is no further question. But the one question that remains for me a bit is the question of trust. If this issue of trust is so central, do we just have to wait until it naturally comes back? Do we have to wait for another generations of politicians that will start to see things differently, that will not have will have a blank sheet in front of them, or what can we hope for? Dan and Ivan, I think is mostly to you, but Laura, obviously, happy if you also have want to comment on this as concluding round of comments. Who wants to go first? Dan, you have the mic open, I think.
Okay, look, you know, in all personal relationships, just like relationships between countries, it takes time. You know, trust did not evaporate overnight. We had a very good level of trust, I would say, in sort of 2011 into 2012. And the deterioration starts from that point. So, you know, you're looking at almost a decade to get to where we are now. So I think it would be unrealistic for us to be able to expect to get anywhere near close to that without some years and some major events out there. But while I've got the mic here, look, I just want to add one other comment on the end. And that's on which Laura flagged in her slides, and I should have said something then, is alignment between the US and EU sanctions, I think, are really important for companies. We have seen places where even in exceptions on humanitarian issues, there is not complete alignment between the US and EU. And it is something that the US-Russia Business Council and others here are pushing for, is for our government to spend more time with the European Union and with the UK on some of these issues. And I would say that's an issue that I would encourage companies to look at. And I will say, in just tooting our horn here in Washington, OFAC and the Bureau of Industrial Security are actually pretty open to dialogue with business. You may not get the answer you want, but you will get a hearing, and things will get factored in. I think the EU is newer in this game, and I think has yet to develop as much of a mechanism for engagement with business. And that's another thing I think your company should push for.
I would really like to emphasize that point as well, because I'll give you a concrete example. Eurochem, right? Swiss company, deals in fertilizer, very important. The US has made it extremely clear that they're not sanctioning the agricultural food sector fertilizers. They put out a specific FAQ saying that Eurochem was not sanctioned. And US banks, you know, have continued, unless they've had a policy to carry out payments for Eurochem. But the EU, it's really difficult to get any kind of FAQs out or any clarity from the EU 30s. And a lot of times you have to go to each one, you know, the Germans and the Dutch and you know, different member states in order to get that clarity. And so, you know, the US, you know, we could walk into OFAC, we can have a meeting, OFAC gets the issue, they put something out. So, but all the horrors of the US sanctions program, at least there's transparency and at least there's a process, whereas we're definitely not there yet in the EU. So I'm just echoing what Dan said. I think that would be perfect to get something. I think that's where the AEB should really help to focus its efforts in trying to get more institutionalized answers from the authorities.
I think that's been very clear also in recent EU discussions that the coordination efforts need to be increased, and that one of the historical difficulties with EU sanctions have always been that they're decided at EU level and implemented national, which led to all kind of discrepancies and differences. And I fully agree. This is a new institution that is now only in the development, and we will see what kind of effect and how powerful it became both upstream and downstream in terms of making it coherent and easier for businesses to get orientation and guidance within what is allowed and what is not allowed. Ivan,
yeah,
back to trust.
Just a couple of words about trust. I think that we should distinguish two levels. One is government to government and other business to business and people to people. The trust on the second level is still quite high. There are many examples in Russia when the companies are getting out from the market. However, they keep relations with the managements. They delegate the Russian management, the business. They still keep connections. And in case of getting back to normality, there will be opportunities of rebuilding the businesses. They're rebuilding the ties. Of course, we are all affected by the media narratives on both sides, but still the level of critical thinking on the level of business is quite high. On the level of academia, think tanks, we still, many programs are suspended on the level of think tanks, but still we remain in touch in one way or another. On the government to government, it's much harder due to different reasons, and here I would probably agree with what Dan said. So it took us a decade to deteriorate, but it may take even more to get back to some level of trust on this first level. But anyway, this doesn't preclude us from a continuation of cooperation on our levels, and at some point this may galvanize the gov to gov at some point, I hope.
Indeed, spillover effects and
right.
and second, time, as Dan said, time is definitely of the essence. And whether, as you said, Dan, the degradation started in 2012, or whether it started earlier, there could also be a case made that it started much earlier, given the history of conflicts that occurred prior to 2012. But anyway, the factor of time needs to be counted in. It's simply that probably having known a world where cooperation was at a higher level, we all are so impatient to get back to the world that we knew and that kind of was wasted for something we do not yet fully understand. I would like to thank you, dear Laura, Dan, and Ivan, for sharing your views today with our members. We will continue to have these series and other events. We'll continue to collaborate. I wish you all the best. For you is the full day ahead in Washington. For us, I'm in Baku, Ivan is in Moscow. The day is slowly already coming to a close. So thank you to all who joined, and wish you a good rest of the day or evening, and look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.